Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. I'm Patrick Cummings. I'm here as always with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the principles and practices of nutrition, health, and fitness. And we thank you for tuning into the show. How are you, E.C.?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
Great. We have a cloudy, rainy day here. So if anybody hears rain in the background, it's just me, and I apologize.
What's that noise?
Seriously. This week, we're going to talk about your big takeaways from a new book. I'm going to probably pronounce one of the co-authors' name wrong. Julia Belluz. Is that
I hope so,
close?
yeah.
Yeah, cool. Julia Belluz and Kevin Hall's new book, Food Intelligence, The Science of How Food Both Nourishes and Harms Us. So we're going to dive into that momentarily. But before we jump in, a quick mention. We've been talking about this on the show the last couple of weeks. Gym owners, if you're interested in bringing the 800-gram challenge to your members, head to optimizemenutrition.com/gyms. Sign up to be notified when the first gym challenge launches for the new year. You know how important nutrition is to your members' progress, and you also know how hard it is to get them to take consistent action in the right direction. So skip reinventing the wheel. Join our next gym challenge, optimizemenutrition.com/gyms, and give your members the smartest, simplest path to better nutrition that they've ever tried. All right, EC. Kevin Hall is a name that you've mentioned a number of times in this here podcast or on this here podcast. So maybe let's do a little bit of background. I know you've been reading this for a little bit. Maybe give a quick overview of your thoughts before we dive into the specifics, and maybe remind us who Kevin Hall is.
Yeah, so we've definitely talked about his research related to ultra-processed food consumption, understanding weight loss and why it's difficult, hunger cravings, and also things related to like The Biggest Loser and some of the results that we see from people who participate in that show. So really well-known researcher for doing all of these metabolic ward studies. And so was thrilled to see that he wrote a book, and it's totally exceptional. I mean, it's by far the top recommended nutrition book I will give to people when they're asking for a good nutrition book. I think it does an exceptional job balancing the science, but also in an engaging way. I would say that it's written, and it might be because his co-author has been doing journalism for a while, so maybe she's been helping a little bit with that. But I think it's kind of at a newspaper level reading, so still pretty mainstream, but super accurate scientifically. So it's something that I try to strive to do here on the podcast, and to be able to see that in a book was great. And it covers so many topics. It's only 260 pages-ish. So compared to something like the Attia book, which dragged on for over 400 pages, I mean, he fits into this book, you know, low carb versus low fat and all the different diet trends, hunger and cravings, stress eating, food environment, food addiction, reductionist approach to nutrition, genetic tests, gut health tests, continuous glucose monitors, like how we overconsume protein, sugar sweetened beverages. Like, honestly, I was like, oh my gosh, we talked about that in that podcast. I could list out, you know, about probably at least half of our podcasts, and they're able to weave it all in this book in such a clear and succinct way. I mean, I was thinking to myself, like, I'm surprised, like, he just doesn't throw out some perfect resistance training program in the middle, because it's so complete of everything that we talk about, you know what I mean? So anyway, just totally exceptional. Really enjoyed reading it. My main concern with the book is I don't think it's going to go viral. I hope he proves me wrong. I just don't think it's emotional enough. I don't think it's crazy enough. You know, there was not a single statement in the whole thing that I was thinking, where does he have the evidence to say this? So I'm a little worried that it won't, you know, be Netflixy enough, but I think everybody should run, do not walk, and get their copy of Food Intelligence.
Is there, can you give us like maybe a very high level like thesis for what the book is? Like, you just ran through a lot of bullet points of things that we talk about all the time, but is there like a central argument that the book is trying to make?
Yeah, and I was originally going to structure the podcast this way, but I ultimately kind of just went back to some takeaways that I thought were powerful. But I think it does a great job of explaining what the problem really is, and the problem being like, why do we have this obesity and corresponding chronic disease epidemic? Like, what is really driving that? And then I think what makes the book so strong is explaining all of the distractions about possible solutions. And this is where the gimmicks come into play, like all the personalized nutrition, man, he slams that so well. But anyway, what are all these distractions that we have in the market with the supplements, and no, you have to be low carb, or like I said, the personalized health tech advice. And then ultimately he does provide solutions. And I don't know that the solutions he provides, at least on the personal level, are different than what our audience has heard before, but he does do a great job of what has to happen from like system point of view, from government to potential taxes to potentially like how are we going to change the food environment on a large scale. So I think it kind of runs this gamut of identifying the problem well, identifying our distractions well, and then ultimately how can we solve this problem.
Dig it. Okay, cool. So you
Yeah.
mentioned we're going to do kind of a takeaways episode rather than issue. How did you start formulating what your takeaways were?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, the whole book for me is underlined saying like this and amazing. I was posting on social media a little bit. So it was hard for me to kind of whittle it down. But ultimately, it was a balance of issues where I thought he brought some nuance that I haven't talked about before on these topics. Of course, I think it's, better written than what I do here on the podcast. But nevertheless, I still think there were some things that he had better nuance that we haven't touched on before, and or just the way that he drove home a message that I think we need to hear. So that's kind of how I think I settled, around 6 or so takeaways, kind of both a balance of new, but also just what needs to be resaid.
Amazing. Cool. I'm excited for this. All right, let's get into takeaway number 1, which is that neither energy density, hyperpalatability, nor ultra processing identify quote unquote bad foods, our behavior and consumption relative to our needs to.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about ultra processed foods and understanding that these are these industrial foods that are so ubiquitous in our environment, but he's still part of research to really untangle what exactly is the properties of these foods that results in the overconsumption of them. And I guess he's running this trial that as of the time of this book being released, we don't have the results from it, but he's looking at different foods and the calories and nutrients are matched among these different diets, but then the foods have combinations of being ultra processed or minimally processed, if they're high or low energy density, and if they're high or low hyperpalatability. So it might be like ultra processed foods that have high energy density but low hyperpalatability. And then another group might be getting minimally processed foods that have high energy density and high hyperpalatability. And so just kind of putting it in all these different combinations to sort of see what's really driving our overconsumption. And his prediction is it's really going to be the energy density and hyperpalatability that are going to be the quote problems. And so I think it's, first of all, interesting. I don't think we've ever in a podcast put these 3 terms out there and explain them individually, because they often do travel together, but not always. So ultra processed, like I kind of kicked off with, these are the foods that we find, at the drugstore, at the gas station. They really don't contain a lot of intact whole foods, and they often or always have these ingredients that we don't find in our kitchen. There are all these additives that change the flavor, the texture, the color. Like Doritos, like why do they have that weird orange color? We can't make that in our own kitchen.
Nature.
So that's,
nature.
Not nature. So ultra processed really have these, it's the processing of the food itself and then the additives that make it very distinct. Energy density, we certainly have talked about. This is the number of calories per gram of food. And this is, of course, related to the magic of the 800-gram challenge in comparison to a lot of processed foods. In that with the 800-gram challenge, we can eat a lot of weight, 800 grams, and not eat that many calories, about 400. Conversely, if you were to eat 800 grams of chips or cookies or name anything else, you're going to eat double the number of calories, if not triple or 4 times the number of calories. So maybe 1,600 calories, 3,200 calories. And it's because the calories per gram are so high with high energy density foods. And then that third term was hyperpalatable. And of course, this is related to like how pleasant we find the taste. And what we find about hyperpalatable foods is they tend to come in 3 categories that don't really exist in nature. So they tend to be high in both sugar and fat, so think like ice cream, or hyperpalatable foods tend to be high in salt and fat, potato chips, or high in both salt and carbs. So this could be like freshly baked bread or bagels. And so these 3 words, ultra processed, energy dense, and hyperpalatable, often travel together, but not always. And so it's good to think about things like apple pie. Always good to think about that. But homemade apple pie, that would be an example of something that isn't ultra processed, homemade apple pie, but it's very hyper palatable and very energy dense.
Yep.
And then this was another example that he put out in the book that I thought was so interesting, hadn't really thought about before. Are sugar sweetened beverages, sodas. Yes, they're ultra processed, but they're actually not energy dense because a lot of it's water. And then they also aren't hyperpalatable. They don't have that combination. Yet we know with sugar sweetened beverages that people overconsume them to a degree that's detrimental of their health. And so this kind of is bringing me to the real point of this takeaway, in that we have these nuances of what does ultra processed mean and what does energy dense mean and what does hyperpalatable mean. But we have to be careful about being too dogmatic about those terms and just sort of saying, okay, I'm never eating anything ultra processed, or because it's hyperpalatable, I won't eat it. We instead want to look at what is the end result of our behavior consuming that food. Like what happens when we're around, I don't know, sugar sweetened beverages. It doesn't matter if it's ultra processed, but not energy dense and not hyper palatable. We tend to overconsume it because we don't have any chewing involved, right? Or what happens when we're around homemade apple pie, we tend to overconsume it because it's hyper palatable and energy dense. We want to look at not just what are the properties of a food, but what is our behavior around the food. And the reason why this is important, and we actually did a podcast on it somewhat recently, and he makes this point in the book, we're probably not going to go back to the era where everyone's just home cooking slow, crocker pot stews all day. So there is very likely the chance that ultra processed foods are going to be part of our food environment moving forward. And so now instead of thinking, okay, we're all going to go back to Paleo Stone Age, maybe there are ultra processed foods that we can make that are less energy dense and less hyper palatable and ultimately help people reach better health outcomes. And so the example I like to give here is protein powder. Like protein powder is ultra processed, but nobody's sitting at home overeating protein powder. And so this is why we don't want to get dogmatic about terms. And even you don't want to think about things as, okay, well, this is energy dense, so I can never eat it. And it's like, well, no, there could be a healthy food there. Or this is hyper palatable, never eat it. It's like, no, what is your behavior around the food? How many nutrients do you get because of that behavior? And is that in line or not with your goals versus having these black or white labels about kind of the food composition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Very cool. Takeaway number 2. We are in less control than we think of our eating behavior. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, this one, I actually first saw it from kind of Dr. Spencer Naldowski. He's this obesity doctor who does a lot with prescribing GLP-1 drugs, and he really speaks to the genetic component of weight gain. And he mentions, I've seen him mention it many times, how uncomfortable people get with the idea that we're not in control of our diet and our weight loss outcome as we would like to believe. And so Kevin talks about this too. He writes about, quote, the illusion that we are in full control of what and how much we eat. And that he really rails against a lot of the nutrition tips and hacks that we see so often that don't really ever concede or talk about the influence of the environment. And I know just personally, a lot of people don't like when I say that, yeah, we actually like the taste of processed food. It turns out we like chocolate and we like ice cream. These aren't like moral failures. And that it just sort of depends on the person's habit and environment over the years, how easy it is to change that. This nutrition thing doesn't come down to, oh, they just didn't measure the right number of chips before. And if anybody, regardless of if they want to lose weight or want to change their health or want to change their diet, anybody who's overeaten chips or chocolate or ice cream or pizza, which at this point should cover everybody listening to this podcast, if you've ever overeaten any of them, you have some understanding of the shades of gray of control that we really have. Like, how are you at the bottom of the bag of chips thinking, well, how did I get here, right? Like, I wasn't that hungry. Like, why did I eat all of this? So some people have the genetics where they are more susceptible to that, especially to their conditioned responses and habits they've built over time than others. And they brought up this really interesting study that was looking at tracking people's change in their behaviors related to personal responsibility in concert with our change in the obesity epidemic. So, for example, have people become more or less responsible in areas of like going to college? Not that that's a perfect example, but going to higher education and completing it, or not smoking or not drinking or using a seatbelt or using protection with sex or something like that. Looking at the frequency of people doing those compared to what's happening with obesity. And what this study found was that obesity continues to get worse, where in these other areas where there's this personal responsibility element, it's either staying the same over all the years or people are even getting better. So it speaks to there has to be something besides just this idea of personal responsibility. And of course, it's this dramatic change in the environment that our genetics are responding to. And so, yes, we talk a lot about nutrition here and what you can do. And I do want it to be clear that people can create change and they can change their weight outcome or health outcome or performance outcome. We've done 300 episodes on it. So yes, I do believe that. But this also doesn't mean that we can just focus on, oh, eat right and exercise, that a lot of the lasting change, and we've talked about this before with people who have significant results, really have to come with this dramatic environmental shift, right? It's this wholesale change of not only what's happening in their house, but oftentimes what's happening in their lifestyle, of course, with exercise and even maybe sleep and stress and how that can affect their eating behavior. And it even often will spread out into what they're doing socially and who they're hanging out with and how they spend time, because ultimately that's how much this external factors are driving our eating outcomes. Again, it's not just sort of looking on the back of a bag of chips and like, oh, I should have this much. We have all these other things that are influencing our weight gain and why we eat. And so we have to take a look at them to make that real change.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Takeaway number 3, in virtually every other sphere of life outside of nutrition, where it's difficult to be personally responsible, we've built societal guide rails.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally building on that last point that we don't have as much control as we think. But this is from page 155. Instead of just telling people to drive carefully, we build guide rails and maintain speed limits, airbags, and seatbelts. Instead of suggesting that people boil their water, we treat and filter it at the community level. Instead of asking people not to smoke, we heavily restrict the sale of marketing of cigarettes, tax tobacco, and outlaw smoking in public places, end quote. And yeah, I mean, I partially love that quote because I've certainly talked about the seatbelt and smoking analogies before. But, you know, I definitely focus on how I can provide nutrition solutions at the individual level. But when we look at it at the large scale, especially across, you know, all the people that are trying to help people at the individual level, all of the nutrition coaches, all of the registered dietitians, all of the nutrition gurus, et cetera, when we look at it at the large scale, we're not doing really great. We're not really changing anything. It's kind of a bummer because I do love to believe that I've helped people, but on the large scale, our society is not changing at all. And so this is where, if we really want to make a massive change, we do need more societal controls. We do need more guardrails, and this would be, you know, with the government's help. And I think the book does a great job of pointing out what are kind of barriers in that becoming a reality at this point. One is going back to that idea that a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea that we don't have as much control. And this was crazy. This is from page 140. Despite the widespread and longstanding appreciation among scientists of the role of the food environment in causing our health to collectively deteriorate, the popular and political focus has remained on individuals. In an international survey of some 300 policymakers, more than 90% said they thought personal motivation was likely the cause of rising obesity rates. So here you have a survey of 300 policymakers, pretty big. 90% of them thought it all came down to just motivation. And so this is some of the difficulty with enacting some of these policy change guide rails that, you know, he's suggesting I agree with, is scientists don't write the policy. You know, Kevin Hall knows all about how the environment can really drive eating behavior changes, but it's the elected officials that will then enact certain policy. And of course, kind of the second barrier there with policymakers is, you know, there's a lot of money that they're influenced by. And so this next point, he was talking about the global revenue for the food industry is valued more than the oil and gas industry, which I was just like, what? You know, food revenue is higher than oil and gas at roughly 6 to 8 trillion US dollars. And then between 1998 and 2020, alcohol, gambling, ultra-processed foods, and tobacco industries poured approximately $3.26 billion into lobbying in the US, where the ultra-processed foods were most of that, spending $1.15 billion. So we've got all of this, tons of money lobbying for ultra-processed foods and what are the regulations around that, it, of course, when it comes time for the elected official, not the scientist, to write the policy, they're often going to be influenced by that money because it, you know, their career and them getting reelected depends on that. And so it's really going to be challenging to be able to make some changes. I'm hopeful. We made changes with smoking, so I think we can make changes for sure. But nevertheless, it's pretty hard to do because of, one, this personal belief that people really do think it comes down to just motivation, and then two, the money that's behind ultra processed foods. And you know, he does make a good point that these ultra processed food companies, you know, I think we said this with the review of the Ultra Processed People book, you know, they don't sit down at the outset and say, okay, we're going to make the entire society sick. Like, let's do it. You know, that wasn't really the goal. It's just that when you look at a company whose goal is to increase profits, ultimately this solution comes at the expense of their profits. And so this is where we start to see that misalignment.
This is a different rabbit hole we do not have to travel down, but the similarities between what you just said around nutrition and social media are so interesting to me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Like there may be, like he said, and that we just talked about, like there's no societal guardrails around it. There are also no societal guardrails around social media. And there's also this idea that like, it's all about personal responsibility. And if you don't like it, if it hurts, whatever, just turn it off.
Interesting.
And it's clear that it's not as simple, just like it's not as simple as just like, hey, you just got to eat less junk, right? Like it's easy to say.
Gotta be motivated.
Yeah, exactly.
So be motivated to turn off your Instagram scroll.
Takeaway number 4, we would significantly advance our nation's health by helping people adhere to the one-size-fits-all generic diet advice rather than advancing personalized nutrition health tech. You already said he kind of railed against the personalized nutrition. Yeah,
it was awesome. I mean, because he talks about continuous glucose monitors, gut health tests, DNA-based diet advice. All of these issues that I've tried to bring up are really summarized quite well. And what's really interesting is that co-author Julia, she did 3 of these different private company tests, specifically with continuous glucose monitors. I think it was NutriSense, Zoe, and Viome. And she's doing the blood glucose thing. And then 2 of them, Zoe and Viome, also end up giving gut health recommendations based on a stool sample she sends in.
Got it.
And so she ends up getting these personalized nutrition advice from all of them to varying degrees of detail. And none of the tests made the same recommendations. Which is just sort of awesome. Like they recommended different foods, despite, maybe they both said that she had excellent microbiome, but then they both recommended that she really needed to focus on different foods. One said her glucose response was poor, another said it was good. And then there's all these different permutations of kind of what the recommendations were. And what was really like just kind of interesting to step back from that experiment is like the layperson is never going to have that experience to sort of chuckle and laugh at it, because who signs up for 3 at the same time? I mean, who A, has the money, but B, is like, oh, this is fun. Let me wear 3 continuous glucose monitors and compare the results, right?
Right.
So you can just sort of see how this regular person goes into this thing thinking you're getting all this personalized information, yet when you see it laid out in the book, how silly it is and how she could never possibly follow this stuff despite the fact that it's junk science. And then what was really interesting is, so one of her recommendations was she had poor glucose response or whatever. So she actually went to her regular MD doctor and got HbA1c measured, which is glycosylated hemoglobin. It's a known validated metric to measure blood glucose over the last 3 months. It's one of the metrics we use to diagnose diabetes. Anyway, comes back fine. But what they did, because this was part of her routine screening, was she also got her cholesterol measured at her MD doctor, and she found out that was high. And none of the companies in her like optimizing health crap told her concern about her cholesterol. Yep. And they were talking about they were talking with a registered dietitian who sees a lot of people who come in after doing this continuous glucose monitor stuff and has the same sort of issues, that people have become so scared of these glucose spikes, as we've certainly talked about before. They end up switching to these lower carb, higher fat foods because they think those are better to avoid all these glucose spikings, yet they've actually increased their health risk because now they've increased their LDL cholesterol, which we know is a known risk factor for heart disease. So it's not just the fact that this junk science is giving poor information that's not consistent and not validated, but some people end up making food choices that put them at a greater health risk. Yeah. And then another point was that Kevin was presenting his research on continuous glucose monitors, which we've talked about before, the fact that a device might not give you the same results between eating the same meals, or that different devices don't give you the same results as the co-author experienced. And so he's at this conference, and at one point, this is a quote from page 204, someone posed a question to the panel: would resources be better spent improving the food supply of the population according to what is already known about a healthy diet, or advancing precision nutrition to prescribe the right diet for each individual? The answer was clearly the former. Even the scientists in the room who had already invested heavily in the field recognized this, end quote. So Like people who are neck deep in continuous glucose monitoring know that there's more value to be made from a society health perspective on doing the whole let's eat more whole foods and cut back on sugar thing than there is looking at these little spikes that you're getting from these various health tech companies. And so one of the things that he says that I just love is that the one size fits all generic advice doesn't fail because everyone is different. It fails because of the modern food environment, which he highlights quite well. And so, yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I think we talk about here a lot is you don't need this hyper personalized health tech advice. I mean, sure, I advertise personalized plans, but what I'm talking about there is, yeah, you might not get the same number of calories as, I don't know, a 30-year-old guy who's a top level Olympic athlete or something like that. And yeah, your protein needs might different. And yeah, you might not like broccoli. That's the level of personalization that we need in our diets, not these wellness health tech devices. They're literally modern day snake oil. And he does just a phenomenal job taking it all down.
Yeah, geez. Okay, let's keep on rolling because this is fun. Takeaway number 5, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I love this one in part because I have my principle number 5, it's never one thing. This is also a little related to that concept we kicked off with defining ultra processed foods versus hyper palatable versus energy dense. Like we can keep trying to break the food down into these descriptors, but it never really gives us the answer we want, which is like, what's our behavior around the whole gosh darn thing? Another thing about the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is like even what I just mentioned about the personal health tech. You can chase these blood glucose spikes and miss the fact that you're making your cholesterol worse, or you can worry what your DNA says, but then not even know that the data says that they don't do any better than these generic diet advice. But one of the reasons that I had to pull this concept out was because he also just slams supplements. And they're talking to a scientist who's doing research on various, supplements and isolated nutrients. And they just say that over and over we're faced with these negative studies on supplements and that you'd be hard pressed to find too many supplements that accomplish anything other than treat a deficiency state. End quote. And so I think that's something that is overlooked about supplements is, yes, they have value if somebody is truly deficient. If you're truly deficient in vitamin C, you can have scurvy. But this idea that you're going to take extra vitamin C and all of a sudden be health preventative or health protective, we don't have that evidence at all. And in fact, of any of the supplements, it's really getting out of deficiency where there's value. And after that, who knows? And it potentially could be harmful. And he uses vitamin C as an example that we don't even have the evidence that it reduces our risk of catching a common cold. Now, we actually talked about vitamin C a little bit. I think there's a little bit of data that shows some vitamin C can help reduce the severity of a cold, not the risk of getting it, but reduce the severity of a cold by about 10%. But the dose that will do it, you would get on an 800-gram challenge. So why are you taking all these supplements that's giving you like 300% of your vitamin C every day? You don't need it, right? And that's one of the most basic known nutrients out there, vitamin C. And we have tons of research on vitamin C, not much evidence to do anything above a deficiency state. And so not only does he point out the limitations of, we've tried to isolate down these supplements and take them and we don't seem to see a good effect. We don't have evidence for them. But then above and beyond them, we actually have the potential for harm. We have the potential for overdose. He talks about a vitamin D overdose of somebody in the UK because they were concerned about low sun exposure, of course. We have the potential exposure to banned substances that we've talked about, pharmaceutical compounds that people don't want in their supplement, or contamination. I always remember the example of there was heavy metal contamination in prenatal vitamins that they found, right? So this is all due to the lack of regulation around supplements. And I think people just sort of think about them as this harmless insurance for their health, when in reality, there's actually a lot of risks and no obvious benefit to them. And there's just so much powerful marketing behind it because they make such money. But in reality, we don't have evidence for them. And any true deficiencies, especially in the US, have been fixed by fortification in our foods. We don't need these supplements. And so we lack this clear understanding of their benefits in a supplement form. And so I think it just was a great place to remember the whole is greater than the sum of parts. And anytime you catch yourself in nutrition thinking, I just need vitamin C, that's really going to do it. Or I just need to manage my glucose spikes, or I just need to eliminate this food, or I just need to, up my protein a little bit. I can almost guarantee that you're overlooking more comprehensive factors to the solution. And so we really got to be careful of that reductionist approach and kind of step back and take a bigger picture, like what else could be potentially influencing this in a more powerful way. Yeah.
Got it. Last one you've got. And this is a direct quote. The evidence on optimal nutrition has been clear and consistent over decades. It is boring by this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this one I had to put in here. I don't think it's new to our audience, but there's so much great stuff in the book, but when we look at it on a personal level, it's the same stuff that we've been talking about for almost 300 episodes. We're approaching 300.
Nice.
It's we got to eat more fruits and vegetables. We're going to cut back on the sodium and the sugar and all of that stuff. And if you haven't found success with your nutrition, you really haven't found the system that adheres to this idea of more whole foods, not perfection, but more whole foods than not, and also allows for some of your preferences. And we also just want to say with that, not just the nutrition system, but you probably haven't made the changes to your environment that's really going to help set you up for success. So not just your pantry, but also those social engagements, how you use food, how you use food as entertainment. What are the other lifestyle components like exercise, sleep, and stress, because they're all influencing it. So not just am I doing the 3 pillars method, which of course I think is the best way to get about that sustainable nutrition plan, but really have you thought about these other environmental factors that we see time and time again are necessary to address to really get after that long-term change.
Yeah. And I love that ties a little bit back to that previous takeaway of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Because yes, that works kind of on the nutrient level, like the vitamin A versus vitamin E or the entire diet. But it's also, I think we can get really myopic about like, okay, it's my nutrition. If I can just fix my nutrition, then everything will be okay. But you're not paying attention to the stress of your relationships, or the 3 hours you're in the car every day commuting, or the 2.5 hours you spend on Instagram every night. Like, it's like the whole thing is what we're looking for. And of course, nutrition is a big part of it, but it's also, it's zooming out to all of the behaviors and all of the environments that we put ourselves in. And only when we do that can we actually truly make the progress that we say we're trying to make.
Totally. And that's really what I also try to hammer in that principle. It's never one thing, is because sometimes people are so focused on whether or not they're doing enough muscle ups. And it's like, did you sleep last night? It might not be your training at all, So
Totally. Yeah. Maybe you just hate your job.
Right.
Thought about that.
Right. That might be part of it. Yeah, totally.
Easy, this is great. I love that you found a book that you wholeheartedly recommend. We've had a few of them, but they tend to be far and few between. So this was like the full-throated EC approval.
Totally.
So
no comments, no suggestions.
Yeah.
This could be better. That's awesome.
Again, it's called Food Intelligence by Kevin Hall. Thank you, EC. That was great. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Do make sure you're subscribed to the show. And also, gym owners, remember, optimizemenutrition.com/gyms if you want to learn more about getting into the first gym challenge of the new year. We'd love to see you there. optimizemenutrition.com/gyms. We'll be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.